Okay, so let's start with AODA. So the requirements are based on employee level. So they've kind of targeted business size in the amount of employees you have. And that includes, this is also very important, it includes full-time, part-time, seasonal, or contract. So you could be a company that has 2 employees, but you have 50 employees, seasonal or contract. You are held to the highest standard, which is 50 employees up. So something for everyone to remember is that anyone that you employ is considered an employee. So if you're less than 20 employees, there's a list of requirements. You need to create accessibility policies, train your staff and volunteers, plan for accessible self-service kiosks if you need to, provide accessible customer service, implement accessible employment practices, provide accessible information, education and training, create accessible public spaces. So I think the interesting breakdown in the AODA is that it doesn't specifically, until you get to 50 employees and up, it doesn't specifically point out websites, but a lot of these requirements would also apply to web, depending on your business.
They could, yeah. They could. Because the rules are written so vague.
Yes,
sometimes
it's pretty vague, yeah.
You can read into them in many ways. Access means many things.
So provide accessible information. Like if your website is not accessible, you're not providing accessible information.
That's every small e-com business, right? You might not be 50 employees, but you have to follow the accessible information thing. So you're either figuring out how to post it on site, make it accessible via, teletext or something, or on your e-commerce website if you don't have a brick and mortar store. So yeah, a lot of this stuff would apply to those smaller businesses.
Or even, providing accessible customer service. Your website needs to be able to be accessible in order for people to actually get the customer service that they need. There's an interesting excerpt there. The requirement to provide accessible information also applies to any public information such as menus, order forms, and information provided to the public in print, on websites, or on handheld devices. Yeah. So less than 20 employees, you gotta make sure you're providing the information. 20 to 49 employees, very similar. I think the only major difference is that you need to file an accessibility compliance report every 3 years. Okay. Everything else is the same as less than 20 employees. Yeah.
Anything there about, what about the AAA?
The AAA?
AAA,
Say that again?
The AAA.
What do you refer to?
AAA compliance.
Oh. Yeah, I think that's, you start getting into minimum level 2 AA for 50 employees plus. There's no specific requirement or call out to WCAG levels in the legislation.
In the AODA?
In the requirements. So you still need to be compliant, 20 to 49. The only difference is you file an accessibility report every 3 years. So you are actually reporting on your own accessibility practices, which is a requirement. So you still need to be providing accessible information, providing accessible customer service through your website. And then once you get to the 50 employee and up range, then there is a specific call out to you must make all public websites accessible. Mm-hmm. So it's all of the previous requirements, including the accessibility report every 3 years, and then they specifically say by law, which is kind of funny because they sound very, they're trying to make get the message across, right? Yeah. Everything else is the language is pretty neutral, and then when it comes to websites, it specifically says by law you must make all public websites accessible.
Yeah. The government does have really good tools for making the web accessible, and that's when they bring in the WCAG stuff, because they'll say, like, above 50 employees, you have to follow this parameter, which is just a derivative of the WCAG policy with a link out to the WCAG framework. So the government they're at least not rewriting WCAG, but they're just pointing people to it. So they might not be explicit about the A, AA, AAA tiers, but they're implicit in that they write it in there and then link out to it.
You do not have to make your internal websites compliant unless an employee asks you for accessible, like employees, you should be able to provide an alternative accessible format for the information on your internal web for your employees. But you don't have to have WCAG level A or AA for your internal websites. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, the Government of Ontario and Legislative Assembly of Ontario must make their internal websites meet WCAG 2.0 levels AA, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. Like, I think to some of the projects we do in the cultural sector that are funded by the Digital Museums of Canada, like, they're really fascinating because you get a grant from DMC, but the strings attached to that grant are if you're making an engaging cultural or historical website, you must follow AA standards. Otherwise, they will not release the funds. So
I just find it interesting that AAA is pretty rare, even within the government itself. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah.
So non-compliance. So the AODA gives the government authority to set monetary penalties. Pretty wild ones. It's up to $100,000 per day, and personal fines to directors and officers of a corporation up to $50,000 per day if the website is out of compliance. And that's fines per day of being non-compliant. So if you're one of the companies that gets penalties, that just could rack up so significantly, so fast. Mm-hmm.